disrupt some classic conversations around the status of the support in 20th century art criticism. But then I'll go on to very briefly say a few things about some Claire Bishop debates, and then focus for the rest of my time on one particular tangent in one of Claire Bishop's essays, where she likens the curator to a stage manager, and you'll see I'm interested in trying to figure out what that means. So first, it seems to me that to analyze social practice is inevitably to engage a variety of artistic practices, including those that more and less self-consciously reinvent the territory of sculpture, painting, ceramics, dance, expanded cinema, and more, as a catch-all phrase for a variety of practices that performatively extend inherited art forms in space, duration, embodiment, collectivity. Social practices can induce, it seems to me, all varieties of responses and readings. These responses differ depending upon different receivers' experiences, I would suggest, with prior art forms. If, for instance, we understand an art installation to be a revision of sculpture, we encounter it differently than if we understand it to be a revision of dance. To some, the inclusion of an artist's body in a work is formally innovative. To others, it appears to be bad acting. To some, the dispersal of an art practice is an intriguing dematerialization. To others, it is an assembly of bad sightlines. To some, a durational experiment is tediously slow. To others, it is a meditation on the nature of human endurance. And it seems to me the positions from which we come often structure how we encounter a particular practice and where we understand its innovations to be. Second, I'm also interested in what the social means in social practice, and thinking about a range of political orientations and social goals that might be coming under there, and invoking actually much of what Josh Greene was talking about, that there's more than one idea of what it is to be socially engaged. Sometimes it's about activism, sometimes it's about doing good, sometimes it's about feeling good. Receptions of these pieces can depend upon a receiver's prior relationship to social issues provoked by a piece. And for myself, I'm most interested in notions of what the social is because I'm interested in particular in 20th and 21st century debates about social systems of governance and human care, especially in light of the rise of neoliberalism in a globalizing age. As a number of scholars and politicians debate the continued relevance of, say, state welfare models, or, here we are at UC Santa Cruz, public education, or arts funding, as neoliberal concepts of subjectivity advocate models of autonomous personhood free of such systems. The nature of the social is really very debated territory. So I think about things like the United States' ability to avow or disavow, say, the role of FEMA in post-Katrina. What's the role of a state system there? Or I think about, on my way down, NPR is asking for a pledge. To what degree is calling up for the pledge an institutional capitulation? To what degree do we understand NPR as a particular kind of social institution that needs a certain kind of participation to survive? And it seems to me often that the language of interruption or intervention, if it goes and it has only certain kinds of associations, i.e. if it always means breaking, if it always means disrupting, then it doesn't always provide a range of vocabularies for thinking about other kinds of practices. And I was going to invoke Josh Greene's work, that there's a way that if it's only about disruption, then his gestures of providing occasions for a certain kind of care and connection is neutralized by a language of intervention that would only see intervention as disruption or only as the breaking up of the social. So partly because I need a principle of exclusion for myself, but mostly because I'm concerned about how neoliberal, individuated, autonomous models of freedom can be embraced as radical by artists, I should say, or because I'm a department chair who's concerned about faculty members who think that not doing committee work is a sign of their radicality. I'm most interested in social practices that provoke reflection on the non-autonomy of human beings, inducing what I always call a kind of infrastructural avowal, an avowal of the interdependent systems of support that sustain human beings, that can be felt to constrain human beings. And indeed, one of a key concern for me is the way we find ourselves inconvenienced by systems that support us, and what that paradox means. So those aesthetic and formal questions and those social-political questions collide for me, and I'm hoping that they'll continue to constructively collide around this terminology of support. Joining, say, the artistic impulse to expose the support inherited from Duchamp, the constructivist and minimalist gestures to some degree, with the vexing question of the role of support in globalizing social welfare models, but also in local community spheres. And I'm interested in practices that expose and imagine anew the supporting infrastructure of both aesthetic objects and living beings. And I'm hoping often that the language of support offers a more precise or more pointed way of accounting, historically, theoretically, artistically, and politically, for the phenomenon of social practice, joining the language of collaboration, intervention, relationality, to an equally important language of obligation or interdependency or systemic connection, even in gestures that might also ironize, even as they repeat some of those practices of interdependency. So, as promised, I'm going to think a little bit more, too, about how this relates to the debates in Claire Bishop. Claire Bishop is, for me, fast becoming a kind of Michael Fried of the first 21st century, at least when it comes to conferences like this, sort of that figure that we love to hate or love to wrestle with. And I'm going to have to assume, in many ways, that many of you have read those essays, and it seems that some have. In general, Bishop is concerned about the extent to which ethical judgments and a generalized set of moral precepts govern the goals and analysis of such work in lieu of aesthetic criteria. Her arguments are not always exactly the same, but sometimes Bishop doesn't like art that is doing good, and sometimes she doesn't like art that is feeling good. But together, the essays do reassemble a pretty familiar lexicon for understanding and casting judgment upon a social practice. And very briefly, some of those languages seem to me barometers that measure an artwork's place amongst a number of polarizations. Social incorporation versus social antagonism are two ways that she binarizes. Legibility versus illegibility. Radical functionality versus radical unfunctionality. Or artistic heteronomy versus artistic autonomy. The thrust of Bishop's discontent is that the social turn in art practice is in danger of emphasizing the first in this series of pairings over the critical, illegible, useless, and autonomous domains that art must necessarily inhabit to be itself. So Bishop draws some new lines in the sand around some very old debates about aesthetics and politics. And she says, the best collaborative practices of the past 10 years address this contradictory pool between autonomy and social intervention and reflect on this antinomy both in the structure of the work and in the conditions of its reception. She goes on to say, the best work attempt to think the aesthetic and socio-political together rather than subsuming both within the ethical. And I find myself finding it difficult to disagree with having an interest in that kind of conjunction. Along the way, it seems to me a pretty cliched, masculinist, edgy, can't-pin-me-down vision of the unintelligible artist as individual author can go unquestioned, while the collaborative, do-gooding social practitioner is dissed in familiarly gendered and literalizing terms. And another concern for me, from my position, is the way that the focus on elements of experience, collaboration, ambiguous authorship, affect, literality, that kind of language, have an all too anti-theatrical ring. Bishop is neither the first nor the last to see an easy equivalence between theatricality and, say, consumer economies when her citations call the stage of the experience, invoke the experience economy and the concern that she has that social practices are embedded in a certain kind of culture industry that's very reminiscent of Adorno. So there's a way, for me, from my position, that like Plato, like Adorno, J.L. Austin, Michael Fried, that a certain kind of anti-theatrical language also comes in. I'm always very interested when that happens and what's going on for people when they use an anti-theatrical language to critique, to give a pejorative cast to the limitations of whatever they're analyzing.